Trans man mocked at coffee shop, then a renowned actor changes everything. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Adrian stepped inside, tucking his hands into the pockets of his jacket. The place was warm, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon filling the air. He had been coming to this coffee shop for months now, one of the few places where he could sit and exist without feeling like he had to prove anything. At least, most of the time. He adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder and moved toward the counter, scanning the menu out of habit even though he already knew what he wanted. The barista behind the counter, a guy in his early 20s with messy brown hair and an unimpressed expression, barely looked up as Adrian approached. He was chewing gum, arms crossed over his apron, exuding the kind of energy that suggested he didn't really want to be there. Adrian cleared his throat. "Can I get a medium caramel latte, please?" The barista raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering over Adrian's features. There was a slight hesitation, a shift in his stance, before he let out a scoff. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, punching it into the register. Then, just loud enough for Adrian to hear, he added, "Can't even tell what some people are anymore." Adrian's stomach clenched. His fingers instinctively curled into his jacket pockets, his knuckles going white. He had been here before, not just in this cafe, but in this moment, where someone decided they had the right to question his existence. He inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Excuse me?" The barista shrugged, popping his gum. "Nothing. Just saying, people should at least try to look normal, you know? Makes things less confusing for the rest of us." A couple of people in line behind Adrian shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat, as if debating whether or not to step in. But no one did. The air felt heavier, the quiet hum of the cafe seeming distant now. Adrian swallowed the sharp retort on his tongue. He could fight back, call the guy out, demand to speak to a manager. But deep down, he knew how that would go. People like this always had excuses. It was always just a joke or just an opinion. And somehow, he was always the one expected to not take things so seriously. He exhaled slowly. "Just make the drink." The barista smirked but turned to the espresso machine, clearly pleased with himself. Adrian pulled out his wallet, trying to ignore the tight feeling in his chest, the way his heart hammered against his ribs. He was so tired of this. Of walking into spaces and having to brace himself for something like this to happen. As he reached for his card, he felt a presence beside him. A voice, smooth and firm, cut through the air. "Wow, that's how you talk to customers." Adrian turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing beside him, arms crossed, was a man he immediately recognized. A famous actor. A face seen on movie posters and award shows. Someone whose voice had been heard by millions. And right now, that voice was filled with quiet, controlled anger. The barista looked up, his smirk faltering slightly as he registered who was standing there. The actor stepped forward, eyes locked onto the barista. "No, go ahead. I want to hear your explanation." The entire cafe had gone silent. Customers, employees, everyone was watching now. Adrian's fingers trembled slightly around his wallet, his mind still catching up with what was happening. Because in all the times he had been through something like this, no one had ever stepped in like this before. The silence in the cafe stretched, thick with tension. The barista shifted on his feet, his earlier smugness cracking under the weight of the eyes now fixed on him. His fingers twitched near the register, as if debating whether to keep going or backpedal. I was just joking," he muttered, his voice quieter now. The actor let out a slow, measured breath, his expression unreadable. That wasn't a joke. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharp, something firm. The barista glanced at Adrian, then back at the actor. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. That's what people always say when they get caught," the actor replied, his voice still steady. "They don't mean anything by it. But somehow, people like him," he gestured toward Adrian, "always end up being the ones who have to deal with it." Adrian swallowed hard, his chest tightening. It was strange, hearing someone say it out loud, lay it out so plainly. Usually, these things went unspoken, brushed off as misunderstandings or oversensitivity. But not this time. The barista's lips pressed into a thin line. He was stuck, trapped in a moment he couldn't escape from. And the worst part? He knew it. The actor took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words cut through the air like steel. You don't have to like or understand everyone who walks in here. But what you do have to do is respect them. That's your job. That's the bare minimum. The barista's face was pale now. He looked around as if searching for backup, but none of the other employees came to his aid. The customers had gone still, their eyes flicking between the confrontation and their untouched coffees. Adrian felt his breath come quicker. He wasn't used to someone standing up for him. Not like this, not in a way that made it clear there was no room for argument. The actor tilted his head slightly. "What's your name?" The barista hesitated. "Tom." "All right, Tom," the actor said, his voice deceptively smooth. "Tell me something, do you think what you said was acceptable?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. Because if you do," the actor continued, "then maybe you shouldn't be working here." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the cafe. Someone near the back muttered, "Damn." Tom's eyes widened slightly. "Wait, what? You work in customer service?" the actor said plainly. "And you just made a customer feel like he didn't belong here. If I were the owner, you'd already be fired." Tom's jaw clenched. "Look, I don't care what you meant to say," the actor cut him off. "I care about what you did say." Another heavy pause. Adrian could feel every beat of his heart pounding against his ribs. He wasn't sure if he wanted to step in or just let this play out. Tom finally broke eye contact, looking at the register as if it held the answer to his problems. He exhaled sharply. I'm sorry, all right?" The actor didn't move. "Apologize to him," he said, nodding toward Adrian. Tom swallowed, then turned to Adrian. His expression was strained, forced, but the words came out. "I'm sorry. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was something." Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He wasn't sure how to respond, wasn't sure if he wanted to respond. The actor studied Tom for another long moment, then nodded slightly. "Good. Now go make his drink." Tom stiffened but turned toward the espresso machine without another word. The weight in Adrian's chest loosened slightly. It wasn't about the coffee anymore. It never had been. It was about the principle. The reminder that he didn't have to just accept the way people treated him. That someone, somewhere, was willing to say, "This isn't okay." The actor turned to Adrian then, his expression softer now. "You all right?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just not used to that." The actor gave a small smile. "You shouldn't have to be." And for the first time in a long time, Adrian felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. The hum of the espresso machine filled the cafe, masking the lingering tension in the air. Tom, the barista, worked in silence, his movements stiff and mechanical as he prepared Adrian's drink. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the actor, as if hoping this would all just go away. But it wouldn't. Not today. Adrian still felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been in situations like this before, but never had anyone stopped everything to stand beside him. There was always an expectation to brush it off, to let it roll over him like water, to not make a scene. But this man, this famous man, had done the opposite. He had turned the moment into a lesson. Not just for Tom, but for everyone watching. The actor leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed but his presence undeniable. He hadn't raised his voice once, but he didn't need to. His words had carried their own weight, and everyone in the cafe had felt it. After a few more agonizing moments, Tom finally placed the caramel latte on the counter and muttered, "Here." Adrian hesitated before stepping forward to take it. He could feel Tom's eyes on him, waiting for some sort of reaction. But Adrian wasn't here to make him feel better about what had just happened. He grabbed the drink and turned to the actor. "Thanks," he said quietly. The actor nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. Adrian wanted to say more, to express how much this meant, how it had shaken something loose inside him. But words failed him, so he just nodded and stepped aside. The cafe was still eerily quiet, as if everyone was waiting for some kind of resolution. Then, one of the customers near the back clapped. It was a slow, deliberate sound, and within seconds, a few more people joined in. It wasn't loud, it wasn't exaggerated, but it was acknowledgement. A silent agreement that what had happened wasn't okay, and that someone had done something about it. Tom's face burned red. He turned away, pretending to wipe down the counter, pretending that none of this had affected him. But Adrian knew better. The lesson had been learned. The actor turned back to him. "Mind if I sit with you?" Adrian blinked. Sure." They moved to a small table by the window, and Adrian set his cup down, still processing everything. "You don't have to explain anything," the actor said, as if reading his mind. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I just don't know how to react. I'm used to handling this alone." The actor tilted his head slightly. "You shouldn't have to be." Adrian met his gaze. There was no pity there, just understanding. And that, more than anything, made something tighten in his chest. For once, someone saw him. Not as a debate. Not as a lesson. Just as a person who deserved respect. Adrian wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving behind a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Across from him, the actor stirred his own drink casually, as if this were any normal conversation. But it wasn't normal. Not for Adrian. He wasn't used to someone stepping in, standing beside him instead of looking the other way. He had spent so much time pretending these moments didn't bother him, swallowing his anger, convincing himself that fighting back wasn't worth the energy. But today had been different. "Does this happen a lot?" the actor asked, his voice level, careful. Adrian let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "More than you'd think." The actor nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "And you usually just let it go?" Adrian hesitated, then shrugged. "What else am I supposed to do? If I react, I'm the one causing the problem. If I ignore it, it just keeps happening. It's exhausting." The actor studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "That's what people count on, you know. They want you to get tired. They want you to feel like it's easier to stay quiet." Adrian swallowed hard. He had never put it into words like that, but the truth of it hit deep. The actor continued, his voice steady. "You shouldn't have to fight every single time. That's not fair. But the only reason people like him get away with it is because most people don't say anything." Adrian glanced over at the counter, where Tom was now pretending to be busy, his head down, shoulders tense. It was clear he felt what had happened, even if he wasn't willing to admit it. Maybe he would change. Maybe he wouldn't. That wasn't Adrian's problem. But today, at least, someone had made him think twice. Adrian looked back at the actor, studying the man he had only ever seen on movie screens. He wasn't sure what had made him step in today. Was it just instinct? A sense of justice? Or had he seen something familiar in Adrian's struggle? "Why did you say something?" Adrian finally asked. "Most people just watch." The actor's expression turned thoughtful. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "Because I remember what it feels like to be on the other side of that counter." Adrian blinked, caught off guard. The actor smiled slightly, but there was something deeper in his eyes. "I wasn't always the guy people recognize. I've been dismissed, overlooked, treated like I didn't belong. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to be the person I needed back then, I wouldn't hesitate." Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected an answer like that. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He didn't feel like someone who had to fight alone. He nodded slowly. "Thanks. For today." The actor smiled. They sat there for a moment, sipping their coffee, letting the world move around them. The moment had passed, but something had shifted. And Adrian knew that no matter what happened tomorrow, today had mattered. The cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations picked up, the espresso machine whirred, and people went back to their coffee and laptops, as if the moment had never happened. But Adrian felt it lingering, the shift in the air, the weight of what had just taken place. Tom, the barista, still kept his head down, his movements careful, like he was trying to make himself invisible. The customers who had watched the confrontation seemed more aware now, glancing at Adrian and the actor with something between curiosity and admiration. Adrian let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was relieved. Another part of him was still processing. The actor took a sip of his coffee, watching him carefully. "You okay?" Adrian nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Yeah. It's weird having someone step in." The actor tilted his head slightly. Weird good or weird bad? Adrian thought about it. He had spent so much time learning how to navigate these moments, how to shrink himself to avoid them entirely. He wasn't used to being seen, especially not by someone with this much presence, this much influence. "Weird good," he admitted. "But also new." The actor smiled. "New can be good." Adrian looked down at his coffee, swirling the foam absent-mindedly with his spoon. "You said you've been on the other side of it before." The actor nodded. "Yeah." Adrian hesitated. "What happened?" The actor exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. "I was young. Trying to make something of myself. Worked all kinds of jobs. Restaurants, retail, even cleaned offices at night just to get by." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I learned pretty quickly that people like to judge you before they know anything about you. They decide who you are based on what they see, and sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it." Adrian nodded, understanding that all too well. The actor's gaze flickered toward the counter. "And when you're treated like that enough times, you start wondering if it's even worth pushing back. If it's easier to just let people believe whatever they want." Adrian swallowed. "Yeah." The actor turned back to him. "But that's how they win. That's how they get away with it. So, whenever I see it happening, I say something." Adrian studied him for a long moment. "You didn't have to." "I know," the actor said simply. "That's why it mattered." Adrian felt something shift inside him. Maybe standing up for himself wouldn't always be easy. Maybe some battles weren't worth fighting. But today, this one had been. Because today, someone had reminded him that he wasn't alone. And that, more than anything, was what he had needed to hear. Adrian sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. The coffee in his hands had long since cooled, but he didn't care. He was too caught up in what had just happened, too wrapped up in the realization that today had been different. He wasn't used to people stepping in for him. He wasn't used to being seen. The actor leaned back as well, watching him with an easy patience, as if he understood that Adrian needed time to process. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe around them had returned to normal, but there was still a quiet buzz in the air, as if people were replaying what had happened in their heads, whispering about it behind their coffee cups. Adrian exhaled. "I guess I just got used to handling this kind of thing alone." The actor nodded. "I get that." Adrian hesitated before continuing. "And when it happens, I always think about what I should say. What I could say. But I don't." He ran a hand through his hair. "Because if I do, I'll be the one making a scene." The actor studied him for a moment. "And what's so bad about making a scene?" Adrian let out a soft laugh. "You know how people are. If I say something, I'm sensitive. If I call it out, I'm overreacting. If I push back too hard, suddenly I'm the bad guy." The actor took another sip of his coffee, thoughtful. "And what happens when you say nothing?" Adrian shrugged. "It keeps happening." The actor nodded. "Exactly." Adrian sighed, staring into his cup. He knew the truth of it. He had always known. But it was easier to pretend it didn't matter, to let people like Tom get away with their quiet cruelty. Because what was the alternative? A fight? A confrontation? He didn't want every interaction to feel like a battle. But today had been different. Today, someone had stood beside him. And it had changed everything. The actor set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. "You don't always have to be the one fighting. But you also don't have to carry this alone." Adrian met his gaze, something shifting in his chest. "It just gets exhausting." "I know," the actor said. "But the moment you stop standing up for yourself is the moment they win." Adrian let that sink in. He wasn't sure he was ready to believe it yet, but maybe he was getting there. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had permission to take up space. To exist without apology. And that was something worth holding on to. Adrian let the words settle, their weight sinking into the spaces he had spent years trying to keep light. He had learned to brush things off, to let them roll past him like waves hitting a rock, wearing him down little by little. But today had been different. Today, someone had reminded him that he wasn't the problem. He looked out the window, watching the people pass by, oblivious to the quiet battle that had taken place inside the cafe. How many of them had been through something similar? How many had chosen to stay quiet because it was easier, because it was safer? He let out a slow breath. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now. The actor chuckled, shaking his head. You don't have to do anything. Adrian frowned. But, no, really, the actor interrupted, setting his coffee down. You don't have to have some big revelation. You don't have to start confronting every jerk you meet. Just knowing you deserve better is enough. Adrian blinked. He wasn't expecting that. He had spent so much time feeling like it was his responsibility to push back, to correct people, to justify himself. But maybe it wasn't his job to fix everything. Maybe he could just exist. The thought was strange. Foreign. But freeing. The actor leaned back in his chair, watching him. You know, I used to think that if I just worked hard enough, if I proved myself enough, people would stop treating me like I didn't belong. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. But that's not how it works. Some people are just looking for a reason to tear others down. And the more comfortable you get in your own skin, the less power they have over you. Adrian swallowed. That's easier said than done. Yeah, the actor admitted. But it gets easier. Adrian traced the rim of his coffee cup, thinking. He had spent years trying to mold himself into something people wouldn't question, wouldn't challenge. And for what? They still found ways to remind him that they saw him as different. But today had shown him something new. He wasn't alone. And more than that, he didn't have to be. He looked back at the actor, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like hope. Not because the world had changed in an instant, but because maybe, just maybe, he could. Adrian took a slow breath, his fingers still wrapped around his cup. He wasn't sure what to say next. For so long, he had conditioned himself to let things go, to move on, to not let it get to him. But today, he wasn't just moving on. He was sitting across from someone who had seen him. Not as an argument, not as a curiosity, just as a person who deserved respect. And that alone made the moment feel different. The actor gave him a knowing look, as if he could hear the thoughts turning in Adrian's head. He leaned back, sipping his coffee. You don't have to figure everything out right now, he said casually. You can just sit with it. Adrian let out a breathy laugh. That's the problem. I don't know how to just sit with it. The actor smiled. Then maybe it's time you learn. Adrian smirked, shaking his head. You sound like some kind of life coach. The actor laughed, setting his cup down. Nah, just someone who's been where you are. Adrian studied him. It was easy to see people like him, famous, successful, confident, and assume they had never had to fight for their place. That they had always belonged. But that wasn't the case, was it? No matter how far you got, some people would always try to remind you of who they thought you were. Adrian sighed. I guess I didn't realize how much I was letting this stuff get to me. I always thought that if I ignored it, it wouldn't matter. The actor nodded. And how's that been working out for you? Adrian huffed a quiet laugh, looking down. Not great. There's your answer. Adrian exhaled. It wasn't that simple, and they both knew it. But today had been proof that staying silent didn't always make things easier. He glanced toward the counter. Tom was still working, but he looked different now. Less smug, less sure of himself. Maybe he had learned something today. Maybe he hadn't. But that wasn't Adrian's burden to carry. The actor stood, stretching. Well, I should probably get going before people start figuring out who I am. Adrian raised an eyebrow. You think people don't already know? The actor smirked. They're just being polite. Adrian smiled, a real one this time. The first one he had let himself have since walking into the cafe. The actor nodded toward him. Take care of yourself, all right? Adrian nodded back. You too. And just like that, he walked out the door, disappearing into the city like nothing had happened. But something had happened. And as Adrian sat there, finishing his now cold coffee, he realized that he wasn't leaving this cafe the same way he had walked in. Because today, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Adrian sat in the quiet hum of the cafe, staring at the door long after the actor had left. The space felt different now, as if something had shifted, not just in the room, but in him. For years, he had learned how to endure moments like this. How to let them slide off his back, how to pretend they didn't matter. But today had proven that they did matter. Because when someone had finally stepped in, the world hadn't collapsed. No one had rolled their eyes at him for making a big deal out of nothing. No one had told him to just let it go. Instead, people had watched. They had listened. And for once, someone else had carried the weight of it for him. He took another sip of his coffee, the caramel flavor now lukewarm but oddly comforting. Across the counter, Tom was still working, quieter than before. He didn't make eye contact, didn't smirk like he had earlier. If anything, he looked like he just wanted to finish his shift and disappear. Adrian didn't care. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. What mattered was that for the first time, someone had made it clear that he wasn't the problem. That knowledge settled deep inside him, warm like the coffee in his hands. He took his time finishing his drink, letting the cafe return to normal around him. People were back to their conversations, their phones, their laptops. But every now and then, a glance would flick in his direction, not with pity, but with something else. Recognition. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he stood to leave, he adjusted his bag over his shoulder, rolling his shoulders back, standing a little taller. The weight of today, of every moment like this one, still sat in his chest. But for the first time, it didn't feel so heavy. He pushed open the door, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. And as he walked down the street, blending into the movement of the city, he carried something with him that he hadn't had before. Not just the memory of what had happened, but the knowledge that next time, he wouldn't just endure. He'd stand his ground. The city hummed around Adrian as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the crisp air brushing against his skin. The warmth of the cafe faded behind him, but the moment lingered, not just the confrontation, but everything that had followed. He had walked into that coffee shop expecting the usual routine. A quiet drink, maybe a bit of work before heading home. Instead, he had been forced into yet another moment where someone decided they had the right to make a comment about his existence. But this time, he hadn't been the one to carry it alone. He adjusted the strap of his bag, exhaling as he moved with the flow of pedestrians down the busy street. A part of him still wanted to unpack what had happened, to go over the details again and again, like he always did. What if he had said something different? What if he had pushed back harder? What if the actor hadn't stepped in? But that last thought made him pause. Because if the actor hadn't said anything, Adrian knew exactly what he would have done. He would have let it go. He would have shaken his head, taken his drink, and left without a word. Maybe he would have vented to a friend later. Maybe he would have buried it deep, adding it to the pile of unspoken moments that never quite faded. But today, someone had said something. And for the first time, Adrian had witnessed what happened when someone didn't just look the other way. He had felt what it was like to have someone stand beside him, not out of obligation, not because they had to, but because it was the right thing to do. That feeling stuck with him, settling somewhere deeper than just the memory of the confrontation. As he waited at a crosswalk, watching cars roll past, he thought about how many times he had told himself to stay small, to not make waves, to let people think whatever they wanted because pushing back always seemed like too much effort. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe that's why people like Tom kept getting away with it. Because no one ever told them no. Adrian crossed the street, his steps steady, his mind clearer than it had been in a long time. Today had changed something. He wasn't naive. He knew that one moment wouldn't erase years of ingrained caution. He knew there would be other Toms, other comments, other days where he'd have to decide whether or not to fight. But maybe next time, he wouldn't hesitate. Maybe next time, he'd be the one to speak up first. And that thought? It felt more powerful than anything else. Adrian kept walking, his steps steady, his thoughts still lingering on everything that had happened. The city moved around him, cars honking, people chatting on their phones, the scent of fresh bread wafting from a bakery on the corner. Life went on just like it always did. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that cafe an hour ago, expecting nothing more than a coffee and a quiet moment. He had entered prepared for the usual, to be dismissed, to be mocked, to endure. And yet, today had been different. He reached the next block and slowed down, catching his reflection in a store window. He saw himself the way others did, a man in a dark jacket, bag slung over one shoulder, face calm but thoughtful. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't just see himself. He saw someone worth standing up for. The realization hit like a slow-burning flame, warming him from the inside. It wasn't just about what had happened back there. It was about what it meant. He had spent years convincing himself that letting things slide was the easiest option. That if he ignored the comments, the glances, the whispered remarks, he could move through the world unnoticed. But he hadn't been unnoticed, had he? No matter how much space he tried to take up, or avoid, there were always people who saw him and decided he didn't belong. And today had proven that staying quiet wouldn't make them stop. But speaking up? That could change everything. Adrian exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't used to feeling like this, like he had just woken up to something bigger than himself. He thought back to the actor's words. You don't always have to be the one fighting, but you also don't have to carry this alone. It was the kind of thing people said in passing, but now it stuck with him. Because for the first time, he believed it. A light drizzle began to fall, misting the pavement beneath his feet. Adrian pulled up his hood, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets as he kept walking. Tomorrow, the world would go on. More people like Tom would exist. More moments like today would happen. But next time, he wouldn't shrink. He wouldn't let the weight of other people's ignorance become his burden to carry alone. And maybe, just maybe, he'd be the one to stand up first. The rain came down in a steady mist, coating the pavement with a slick sheen. Adrian didn't mind. The cool droplets against his skin felt grounding, like a quiet reminder that he was here, present in this moment, in this version of himself that he wasn't used to yet. He walked without a destination, letting his feet guide him. His thoughts still spun, looping back to everything that had happened at the cafe. The way the air had changed. The way people had watched. The way someone had finally spoken up. And the way it had felt. He had expected to feel small. Humiliated. Exposed. Instead, he felt seen. That was new. Adrian had spent so much of his life moving carefully, always aware of the space he took up, always prepared for moments like today. But now, for the first time, he wondered, what if he didn't have to be? What if he stopped bracing himself for the worst? What if he walked into places expecting respect instead of hoping to avoid conflict? The thought felt too big, too foreign. Like wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit yet. But maybe, with time, he could grow into it. A car sped past, splashing a puddle onto the curb. Adrian barely flinched, too lost in his own head to care. He turned onto a quieter street, the sidewalks emptier, the hum of the city softer here. He pulled out his phone, hesitating before unlocking it. A part of him wanted to text someone, to tell them what had happened, to get the words out before they tangled themselves into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. But another part of him, the part that was still adjusting to this shift inside him, wanted to keep it to himself. Just for now. Because this wasn't just about one moment in a coffee shop. It was about what came next. How he carried himself tomorrow. And the day after that. How he chose to exist in a world that had spent years trying to tell him he didn't belong. Adrian exhaled, tucking his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't sure what came next. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The rain softened to a drizzle as Adrian kept walking, the rhythmic tap of droplets against the pavement filling the quiet around him. The city's usual rush had slowed in this part of town, just a few stragglers moving through the streets, umbrellas bobbing, headlights reflecting off the wet concrete. He felt lighter somehow, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he hadn't been alone today. That was still sinking in. Adrian had spent so much of his life navigating moments like the one at the cafe, instinctively brushing them off, telling himself that nothing would change if he spoke up. And maybe, sometimes, that was true. But today had proven something else. When someone did stand up, when someone refused to let ignorance and cruelty slide, It made a difference. Not just for him, but for everyone in that cafe who had been watching. He thought about the actor again. About the way he had stepped in without hesitation, without treating Adrian like a burden or a cause. He hadn't made a speech, hadn't turned it into some performative moment. He had just been decent. And the more Adrian thought about it, the more he realized how rare that was. He reached an intersection, stopping at the curb. A neon sign for a late-night diner flickered across the street, casting a warm glow against the wet pavement. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The diner was quiet, just a few people scattered at booths, a couple sitting at the counter. The scent of fresh coffee and fried food wrapped around him like a blanket, familiar and steady. He slid into a booth near the window, running a hand through his damp hair. A waitress appeared moments later, setting a laminated menu in front of him. "Coffee?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "Yeah, thanks." As she walked away, he leaned back against the booth, exhaling. He wasn't sure why he had stopped here, but something about the soft hum of the place made it easier to sit with his thoughts. For so long, he had told himself that moments like today didn't really matter. That they were just part of the world, part of his world, something he had to learn to live with. But now he wasn't so sure. Because today, something had shifted. Not in the world, not yet, but in him. And maybe that was enough. For now. Adrian sat in the quiet hum of the diner, the warmth of his coffee cup seeping into his palms. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light mist, city lights reflecting off the slick pavement. It was one of those nights where the world felt slower, like it was giving him space to breathe. He took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. It was strange. He had spent years convincing himself that these moments, the ones where he was dismissed or mocked, weren't worth dwelling on. That the best way to survive was to move past them, to not let them take up space in his mind. But today had forced him to stop. It had forced him to acknowledge how much weight he had been carrying. And now he wasn't sure if he could, or even wanted to, go back to ignoring it. Because the truth was, something had changed. Not the world, not overnight, but him. For the first time, he wasn't just moving on, he was processing. He wasn't brushing it off, he was allowing himself to feel it. And the more he let himself sit with that truth, the more he realized that he had been doing himself a disservice by always staying quiet. He thought about the actor again. About how effortlessly he had stepped in, how he hadn't hesitated. How he had used his presence to shift the balance of power in an instant. And Adrian had felt that shift. Had felt what it was like to not carry the moment alone. He hadn't realized how badly he had needed that. The waitress passed by, refilling his coffee without a word. He gave her a small nod of thanks before looking back out the window. For the first time in a long time, he felt different. He wasn't naive. He knew there would be more moments like today. There would be more people like Tom. More words meant to cut, to remind him that the world still had its limits on who it accepted without question. But today had given him something else. A choice. A reminder that he didn't always have to let it go. That when the next moment came, and it would come, he could decide to stand his ground. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to do it alone. He took one last sip of coffee, set the cup down, and stood. As he stepped out of the diner and into the city night, he carried something new with him. Not just the memory of what had happened, but the certainty that from this moment on, he would never let himself feel invisible again.